Hello, this is the Sunday School outline for June 27th, 2021. I'm Stephen. I'm titling today's lesson, The Mighty Are Fallen. The lectionary readings for today are 2 Samuel 1:1 and 17 through 27, Psalm 30, Psalm 130, Wisdom of Solomon 1:13 through 15 and 2:23 through 24, Lamentations 3:22 through 33, Mark 5:21 through 43, and 2 Corinthians 8:7 through 15. The Wisdom of Solomon is in the Catholic Bibles, but not the Protestant Bibles. I think it's got some really good stuff in there, so it might be good for you to find it online if you've only got Protestant Bibles. But I'm going to talk completely about 2 Samuel 1:17 through 27. It's the death of Saul and David's reaction to it. The death of Saul is related, and the death of Jonathan too, which I think was more important to David. The death of Saul is related twice in the Bible, 1 Samuel 31 and 1 Chronicles 10. These passages use almost identical language for the main story, and they give slightly different details. In today's lectionary, the Psalm David wrote about the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, and one verse about how David found out about it. But the lectionary leaves part of the story out. The part that it leaves out, between verse 1 and verse 27, it's a pretty violent passage, and it talks about cold-blooded killing, and maybe implies David is a little bit racist. Okay, it implies David is a whole lot racist. Or maybe it just implies that he doesn't like liars. You can read it and make up your own mind. Now, after David ordered the execution of the deliverer of bad news, he wrote an elegy for Saul and Jonathan. Apparently, he later mandated this psalm as part of his military training for archers. I mean, that's in the little heading for it. Some people feel that this passage indicates David and Jonathan were lovers. I'm not sure, but I can say David's sexuality got him into trouble in other places a lot of times. He danced naked in front of everybody one time. He had more wives than any man should need, and them being married to men who liked him didn't stop him. And them being married to men who hated him didn't stop him. For that matter, let's just say David, by all accounts, was a passionate person. He was charismatic, people loved him, and he could do no wrong in their eyes, even if what he did was wrong. But God loved him, and he loved God. Now, I've gotten sidetracked. Let's see what this little psalm says. It's not reprinted in any other part of the Bible, I don't believe. So I'm just going to start reading the psalm. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? How are the mighty fallen is a phrase that has entered into our popular culture. The contrast is between Saul's and Jonathan's might, their greatness, and their demise. How do you pronounce that word? Anyway, they're dying. Each of them had done heroic deeds in the past. They had killed a lot of people between them in single combat and in battles, and each of them, like David, was charismatic, and they were good military leaders. They were also really handsome and good-looking, like David, except they looked like warriors, and David looked like a farm boy. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. So Ashkelon and Gath were two city-states of the Philistines. Just to put things in a very simplified perspective about things back then, the Empire of Carthage, which was a very great empire, and it almost conquered Rome, The Empire of Carthage was a product of the same culture that produced the Philistines. This was a wave of seaborne invaders around much of the Mediterranean, and they're called the Sea Peoples. We haven't quite figured out who they were, but their effect was profound. We get the Phoenicians in our alphabet from them. While the Sea Peoples were colonizing the seacoast, the Hebrews were colonizing the mountains. The Philistines, I believe, were a bit more technologically advanced at the time of Saul. I mean, they had blacksmiths, and Saul's people didn't. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. Being anointed with oil means that Samuel had anointed him as king of Israel. And that apparently was a big thing. The mountains of Gilboa is where Saul led a charge that turned into a rout. It's a small mountain range. And Saul and his 3 sons died, one of whom was Jonathan. Now the relationship between Saul and David was complicated, and Saul had tried to murder David on multiple occasions. We nowadays would say David was bipolar. His contemporaries said that an evil spirit from God affected him. Fact is, he was a little bit crazy, and maybe just a little bit in love with David himself. We don't really know, since he recorded no writing about what he thought. And the relationship between Jonathan and David, though, was all good. They liked each other a lot. Now, the Bible mentions no relationship between David and Saul's other 2 sons, Abinadab and Melchishua. Well, but they died too, and David didn't mention them. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. In other words, if they shot at something, it died. Basically, them dying is kind of unbelievable. These are 2 men who just didn't make mistakes. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. See, didn't I say they were good looking? And in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. They were good looking. They were handsome. They were charismatic. And although they had their differences, I believe Saul tried to kill Jonathan too once. Anyway, they were united in death. And, oh yes, very physically capable. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold on your apparel. Saul was the first king, and he brought style to the kingdom. This is in contrast to the songs that first incited Saul's jealousy, by the way. The women, after David killed Goliath, they said, "Oh, Saul's killed thousands, but David's killed 10,000. Well, they like to talk about killing back then, I think. And this is a direct contrast. Oh, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. The ones that you made fun of earlier, now don't you feel bad? How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. Now, I just got to remember that a high place is another name for a place of worship. Now, I'm not sure this really has any bearing here, but there it is. I'm very distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, that's pretty passionate. But this is a verse that people like to argue about. I personally am not sure this means they were lovers. This would work if they were, but it for sure states that David liked Jonathan better than he liked his wives. Apparently, he liked them at least a little bit. He had lots of kids. Of course, he only had 3 wives so far, and another one that he had been betrothed to. She ended up getting married to somebody else, but he had those kids killed, so it was okay. A very good exercise when you encounter one of these passages people like to argue about, and this is one of their favorites, is to look at aspects of the side opposite to how you yourself really feel. You decide what it would be like if those things were true instead of what you think, and how important your belief is to the greater scheme of things. In other words, does your faith in God die completely if you're wrong? You got to think about that. It shouldn't, by the way. If you're wrong, you're wrong, and God's God. Or when is your belief on one small facet of things important? And it might be very important. It's something you ought to explore. As a gay man, I would love to say that this proves that Jonathan and David were lovers. I'd really like to say that. I can say I believe they were, but I can't honestly say that this passage proves it. You can love people without having sex with them. That's all I gotta say. How are the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? It would be nice if this were a call for peace. You know, beat your swords into plowshares. It isn't. David was not the kind of guy who would beat a sword into a spear point, who would beat a sword into a plowshare. He might beat it into a spear point. He would grind his plow into a spear point. If that didn't work as a weapon, he'd use rocks. David was a man of war. This just states that David's sorrow is that he has lost someone he loves passionately, and someone whom he mostly respected and loved. And it sucks to lose a battle. This poem is about grief, war, and violence as a great freight of trauma for even violent people like David. The people of David's time considered it normal to hate. I suspect that the reason David instructed this poem to be part of his military instruction is that this violence comes with loss, and David was realizing it, and that no matter how mighty you are, your might is not the end. So that's it for my little outline. I hope you have a good week. In about 2 weeks, I'll be we'll be having lessons in person. I may continue doing these outlines and putting them up as an exercise in learning what the lesson is instead of just showing up cold on Sunday morning. So that's it. We'll see what happens. You have a good week.